Okay. Um, there's some kind of government agency called the Enforcement and Collection Authority in Israel, and I'm just trying to get a little bit more information about it. But um, basically, the question that is being raised here is Ha'im mutar liknot mimechira pumbit shel ha'hotza'ah lefo'al. Now, to be motzi something lepo'al means to execute something, to act upon something. But there's apparently a well-known term, as far as this government agency, where I suppose if they confiscate a person's property, they put it on public auction. Um, and so I'm trying, maybe, typically when a person's items are confiscated by the government, that would be done in a case where he owes money to the government, maybe back taxes, and he can't pay them. So the government would confiscate his property and then put it on the open market. Or maybe he's a convicted felon, and in order to be able to pay back debt, or maybe yeah, okay.
Simple forfeiture, or or a seizure. The government agency takes stuff.
Yeah, so this is a question having to do with when the Israeli government seizes property and they put it up for public sale. Is it permissible for a Jew to purchase that property? So let's see the tshuva, and we'll see where we're going with this. So if a person's items were taken from him contrary to halacha, kosav b'shulchan aruch. So the Shulchan Aruch gives the following illustration: Ba akum ba'akifin al Yisrael, v'lokach mimenu sadeh. That if a pagan comes upon a Jew, ba'akifin, using illegitimate methods in order to coerce him to be able to forfeit his property. Here, let's see, Akifin. Yeah, it's like indirectly, and is able to purchase property from him and then sells it or gives it to another Jew. If the Jewish buyer of this property discovers that the property was acquired by this pagan from another Jew in an illegitimate way, so then the Jew who acquired this has to return it to the original owner, even if it was in his possession for a number of years. So we're discussing something that's similar to yesterday's Shaila. If you know that you have stolen goods in your possession, you have to sell it back. And there was what's called takanas hashavim, where you had to make there has to be special restitution given to the buyer of stolen goods. Here, it's not really stolen, but it was sort of confiscated or in some way taken in an illegitimate way. And there too, the Shulchan Aruch writes that the original owner has to compensate the buyer for whatever expenses that he incurred from this pagan who was the seller. The cost of HaMordechai, but the Mordechai qualifies this, and this is what the Ramah brings from the Mordechai, that it's only with real estate that we have such a principle, because usually an owner of real estate is not miyash, does not give up hope of retrieval. However, if you purchase goods, you purchase chattel from a pagan entity, a non-Jewish entity that has acquired this illegitimately from a Jewish source, you don't have to return it or make sure that it goes back to the original owner, because you can assume that they had yeush. You assume that they gave up hope of retrieval. Aval imza sifrei kodesh, afilu shehem metaltalin lo shayach bazeh yeush. He says that's the only exception is if we're dealing with holy scriptures, that even though they're chattel, the original owner doesn't give up hope of retrieval. Kevin shahagoy lo yochol limkor et zerak liYisrael, umemela haba'olim lo mityashim adkan. Because since the only consumer of those goods is going to be another Jew, the original owner assumes that he'll be able to get it back in some way. Okay, in other words, like use the psychology. If I, as a Jew, had an item, let's say a set of Sfarim or a Sefer Torah or a pair of tefillin, confiscated from me in an illegitimate way, and I know that it's going to end up coming into the hands of a Jew, because what non-Jew is going to want to buy a pair of tefillin? So then I don't have Yeush in that situation. So based on this discussion in the Shulchan Aruch, if a person's items were confiscated by a government entity, even by the Israeli government, and the person wishes to make the argument that it was confiscated illegitimately, it wouldn't make a difference, because at the end of the day, you would be permitted to purchase those items since the original owner, we presumably had Yeush, presumably gave up hope, provided that it was not something that was uniquely Jewish for Jewish consumption. So let's say if he gets his car confiscated and it goes up for public auction, you'd be allowed to purchase it. Okay, so that's the general halacha. That would make sense. Aval bizman hazen nira dechol metaltalim shenim karam al yedei ha'otzah lepoal haba'olim lo mityashim mehem. However, Rav Sharaga says, I think that the situation has changed since this halacha was written, and maybe we'll see if he's speaking specifically about Israel or not. He says, I feel that the original owner does not have Yeush. Kevin shahamechira hu mechira pumbit umefursemet va'adam shalakchu lo et ruchusho hu okev kol hazman matai hamechira. And the reason is because the original owner knows that this is a public auction, and he's looking through the papers and going online to discover when is that public auction of my stuff taking place. Umasim b'chol yom shahaba'olim atzmim boim v'konim et chafatzeim umevakshim mehamishtatfim shelo yosifu al hamachir she'im mitziim. And it's a regular occurrence that the original owner will go to the auction to try and retrieve his original items to purchase them. And he'll even ask the other people present, this was mine, please don't raise the price on the auction so that I can get it at a good price. Therefore, it seems that there is no Yeush in that kind of situation, which is, I've never heard of this before. Have you ever heard of someone going to a public auction that's held by the police or the, I don't know. I mean, I've never really participated in these.
Do with cars, like I know Ralph Harvey says he did with cars. It's a good deal.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
But is this ever a situation where the original owner shows up?
That doesn't make sense to me, because if he had the money, then he would pay the government something to buy it back. So it doesn't make sense.
Well, maybe he's got enough money to buy just that one item back. I don't know. Well, let's see him continue this discussion. Ulam kasav harama kol zeh ba'anas she'ein mishpat alav. But here's another qualification. The Rama writes that when the owner has not had Yeush, you shouldn't buy the item, or you have to return the item that you acquired from the Goy and give it back to the Jew, sell it back to the Jew. But that's, says the Rama, is only when the middleman, the Gentile entity, was, let's say, a mobster or some other kind of malevolent force within society, who is not legally authorized to confiscate this item. Aval saru moshel shekatzav al avodav u'misharsa v'lokach o hechrim chayfetz me'echad mehem dina de malchusa dina ve'ein halokea chayav latet laba olim klum. But if a legally authorized entity confiscates something as a penalty from one of the subjects of the crown, let's say, then the law of the land is the law. And therefore, if you want to buy that item from the government, you have every right to do so. And if you discover that it was originally owned by a Jew, you have no obligation to restore it to them. Vimkein b'she'ela hazu shel ha'atzah lepoal kevin shahakol nasa al pi chukei haMedina v'kaimel andina de malchus adina. He says, therefore, when the Israeli government confiscates property, and they do it according to the law of the land, and we paskin that even with the Israeli government, dina de malchus adina, the law of the land is the law. Chemoshe Kosav HaRambam, that the Rambam writes this, Shahamavriach min hameches, lefi ma shekava hamelech kitzvas hameches, hareze gozel manaso shel hamelech. That if a person evades taxes, base and doesn't pay what the government assesses him that he has to pay, then he is stealing his legally necessary portion that he owes the king, the crown. Bein shehu melech Yisrael, bein shehu melech goy, lefi shedin hamelech din. And it makes no difference whether the government entity is Jewish or Gentile, because that's the law of the land. Now, this is a controversial statement because there are some poskim who argue, even bisman hazeh, even today, that the Israeli government does not have the law of dina de malchus dina because they don't recognize the legitimacy of the state, because we're living in a pre-messianic age. So they don't recognize this. But basically, anyone who lives in Israel and recognizes that the government is a system really agrees with Rav Sharaga. Even most segments of the Haredi community recognize the Dina de Malchus Dina in Israel. Because of B'shut Yaskil Avdi, Shehu Adin Shememshala, Sheyesh La Bayit Nivcharim U'Mechokekim, he says in Shilos Teshuvas Yaskil Avdi, he also paskins that any government entity that has regular elections and elected officers, Afal Pi She'ena Me'utarim Ba'ateret Melucha, even though they are not recognized as monarchy, Dinam Din Gomer B'Inyanei HaMedina, they are nonetheless the recognized governmental authorities, B'Shayach Behem HaKlal Dina de Malchus Dina, and therefore the law of the land, that you have to apply, or you have to uphold whatever laws they legislate, still applies. The Herech Badin Ze B'Shut Yichavedas, and Rav Ovadia expands on this issue. So therefore, Dina de Malchus Dina applies to the Knesset, and it applies to the, I guess, what's the Israeli equivalent to the IRS? Who can tell me who's Israeli that's on the line here today? Shmuel, what do they call the IRS in Israel? I'm sure there's some name for it. Okay, but in any event, Mikol Makom Davar Shenoged et hahalacha shel Toratenu Hakdosha Lo Shayach Bazeh Dina de Malchus Dina. However, with that said, anything, if something is in direct contradiction to the Torah, then the laws of the Dina de Malchusa do not apply. So, for example, if the government legislates that Jews have to bow down to a statue, right, the laws of the land would not apply. Right, the laws of the land only apply when it's in usually financial matters or penalties and things like that. Do we say that Dina de Malchusa Dina? But we don't say Dina de Malchusa Dina if there's direct contravention of Torah law. What?
Reshut Hamasim Israel.
Reshut Hamasim?
Israel.
Of Israel. Okay, that makes sense. What?
Reshut Hamisim.
Okay. Okay, I hear you. Thank you.
What's that mean?
Is the taxes authority of Israel.
Mas haknasa.
What is it? What did you say, Shmuel?
Mas haknasa.
Mas hachnasa. That's well, mas hachnasa simply means income tax.
I believe that's the government agency that everybody refers to as the tax authority.
Taxation authority. Because mas hachnasa just literally means income tax, but maybe it's the income tax authority, because it would have to say reshut. Reshut is the authority. ומאחר והחוב מורכב בתוספת ריבית והצמדה והוצאות משפט וכדומה שאין לו חיוב על פי ההלכה והביגזל גמר לפי דיני תורתנו הקדושה. So now here comes a big chiddush. He says, when the government confiscates property, it's because a person doesn't have the wherewithal to pay not only the principal that he owes to the government, but they also charge him interest, and there are also other expenses, let's say the cost of Mishpat, the judgment, and the Torah would not allow for such payments because that contravenes Torah law, and therefore it's a form of the government stealing. And there are times when the government will confiscate a person's property that where he owes, let's say, 100, they'll confiscate an item that's worth 200 for that debt, and then they'll sell it for 50. So the government sometimes does things indiscriminate, which are against Torah law. That you're not allowed to steal items that were stolen by a thief. And you're also not allowed to l'sa'ado al shinuyo, which is a term that I'm not familiar with, in order for people to buy it. Let me just see very quickly. It's a halacha in Siman Shin Samech Tes in Shulchan Aruch. Let's take a quick look there. And he basically says, Shekol ha'osa dvarim elu, and if you do those things that we just said you're not allowed to do, v'chayotze bahen machazik yidei ovrei avera, you're aiding and abetting sinful activity. V'over al v'lifnei iver lo sitein mechshol, you violate the law of lifnei iver, do not place a stumbling block before a blind person. V'halokeach mimenu metaltalin kelokeach min haganav. And therefore, if you purchase items from a government entity that has illegitimately confiscated items, then it's as if you're purchasing from a ganav. So let's just take a quick look. What was the siman again? The siman is Shin Samech Tes. Take a quick look in the Shulchan Aruch. Shin Samech Tes. Okay, the halacha is Asur liknot davar hagazul mehagazlan. You're not allowed to steal a stolen item from a gazlan. And furthermore, Asur lisado al shinuyo kedei sheyikneu. So what does that term mean? So the Sma says, Perish kedei sheyetze miyad hagazlan v'yi yeshinoi rishus, v'yikneu achar kach b'yeyush v'shinei rishus. He says you're not allowed to create or try to promote a situation where the Gazlan will sell it to a third party and then you'll buy it from that third party. Because that you're actually, you're trying to buck the system, you're trying to find a loophole. If you steal something directly from a Goslin, that's usher, and you have to return the item to the original owner. But what if I steal it from someone who I know bought it from a Goslin? So then there's been Yeush, and there's what's called Shinoi Rishus. It's already passed hands from the Goslin to someone else. So there I could argue, well, maybe I'm not doing anything wrong. So the Shulchan Aruch says you're not allowed to do that as well. Shekol ha'osa dvarim elu v'chayotze b'hem machzik yidei ovrei avera va'over al v'lifnei iver lo titein michshol. And because you're aiding and abetting thievery, because basically you're creating a scenario where a person who stole is going to be able to benefit from your efforts. And so therefore, what you're doing is absolutely usher. And therefore, al kain ein safek shim kfar kana ubo ba'alehem lidorsham tzarech lahachzir lehem achefetz. And therefore, if in a situation where you already purchased something from a government auction, Rav Sharaga feels that many times the government confiscates items that are worth much more than the debt that the government had a right to collect for. And therefore, if you should not buy from a government auction, and if you where you know that the original owner was Jewish, and if the original owner comes to you and says, I understand you bought this item which was a family heirloom, let's say a piece of jewelry you bought at this auction, that belonged to my grandmother, I'd like to get it back. You have to return the item to the original owner, provided that the original owner pays you whatever you paid to get it back. And you're not allowed to demand interest payments or any other kind of higher payments based on the fact that the item was with you for a certain amount of time. In other words, maybe you want to charge the guy interest, like I was watching over it for you, and therefore, for the last month or so pay me an added fee. No, whatever you paid, you have to sell it back to him for. That's provided that the original owner came to you at the time that he realized that you have purchased his original stuff from the government auction. Right? But if at the time when you bought the items, they didn't immediately contact you to try and retrieve their items, and it's only after a prolonged period of time, even after they already discovered this, that they ask you to give them back the items. It seems to me, says Rav Sharaga, that if you can ascertain that this public auction was made known to them long before, and it's only much later that they're trying to get their items back, then they were already moichel, they already gave up on these items, and therefore you don't have the right to, they don't have the right to demand that you pay them back. So there's a lot of ins and outs in this tshuva. The first thing that he says, that if you purchase something from a ganav, you have to make restitution of that original item from to the original owner. You're entitled to get compensated, like we learned in the previous tshuva, for something that was that you gained from stolen property, provided that you didn't know that it was stolen. Here in a government auction, it's a little bit different. He says, if the government if a Gentile entity confiscates something from you illegitimately, so then no Jew has a right to purchase that from in an auction, even if it's a public auction, except when the government is authorized because of Dina de Malchusa Dina to hold that auction. But the wrench that he throws into it afterwards is that even though the government is entitled to hold government auctions, but in all likelihood, they often go beyond what is fair and reasonable, and they will confiscate items that are worth much more than the debt that the person who was confiscated from had an obligation to pay. So it's for that reason that the government many times overreaches, and because the government overreaches, you don't have a right to purchase from them because they're dealing now in stolen property. Okay, so there's a lot to discuss here. First of all, Marvin, input.
Yeah, it kind of sounds similar to the secular law about buying something from the back, you have the right of action, get the original owner against you. I'm thinking of tax sales, like if CRA or somebody seizes something, they will add penalties and interest on it too, and they're huge, right? So that makes sense also that maybe you don't have to repay that in halacha, because it can be double, triple the value of whatever it is. So that does make sense to me, that you wouldn't have to, you shouldn't touch that if it's overvalued or, that kind of thing. But there are times when things are seized for the value, the proper value, and then they get valued and appraised, and there isn't much interest or tax, stuff like that. So maybe in that case, it would be okay.
Right. Now, let's also point out that we're dealing in a situation where a person is living in Israel. And because you're living in Israel, it's fairly certain that anything that you're purchasing from a government auction was originally owned by a Jew, in which case you have to be more stringent. But let's say in Canada or the US, there doesn't seem to be the same restriction on purchasing something from government auction.
There are cases also when a bank will say foreclose or do power of sale on a house, somebody's defaulted their mortgage. One of the remedies is that they can put the house up for sale, the lender, and sell it, but the owner can come and buy it, right? Or a relative can come at the auction and buy it back also. So it does happen.
But in cases of foreclosure, no, let's say no priority or preferential treatment is given to the original owner. Is that correct?
That's right.
Best price.
Yeah.
Whoever offers the
They
best.
come up, yeah, and sometimes the prices are low, like nobody comes, and you can get a bargain at some of these power of sale situations.
Right.
Drop in your hook and spill and separate or whatever,
The banks don't care, as long as you get the principal back, they don't
Yeah.
care what price. So,
Yeah, so you can buy stuff, and similarly with police auctions and stuff like that, you can get some real metzias there with stuff that they've seized. People have bought cars and jewelry and things that have been stolen out of safes and stuff go up for auction, and it could be, whatever. You could find stuff.
Anyone ever go to you told me Ralph has done that. Okay. So let's just do a couple of pieces. Well, we're almost out of time. Let me just look at let's look at the final footnote and see. He says, the law of Dina de Malchusa Dina, does it apply in Eretz Yisrael? Kvar herichu haposkim. The poskim have already expanded on this idea. Va'ayin berama sham shekasav da'atam de Dina de Malchusa Dina hu da'amelech yachol ligzor shelo yadiru ba'aretz or im lo yekaimu ma shechokek. He says one of the reasons why the law of the land is the prevailing law is because the government can always eject someone from the country. So because the government can eject you from the country, they can also tell you the laws that prevail by which you're allowed to stay in the country. Because of the bir hagrosham, de lefiza ein dina de malchusa dina be'eretz Yisrael, keven she'eretz Yisrael lakoli. And it's on that basis that the Vilna Gaon held that the law of dina de malchusa doesn't apply in Eretz Yisrael because the government cannot eject you, because Eretz Yisrael belongs to all Jews. So, which is interesting. But the Pischei Choshen, Rav Bloy also says that even according to those poskim that Dina de Malchusa Dina doesn't apply in Eretz Yisrael, they will agree that if a government entity was put into power by popular vote, whereas the majority of the people agree that this should be the law based on the government's decision, then you still have to abide by it. So it's a little bit of a gray area. We'll have to hold it here for today, and we'll continue Mirz Hashem tomorrow. Have a great day.
Rabbi, did you find out what the name of the tax authority is in Israel? If not, it's Rishus Mamasim B'Yisrael.
Reshut HaMasim B'Yisrael. That's what Izzy said.